Hello, this is James from Canonical, and today we are talking about Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders. Okay, so let's talk about the narration and the form first, then. Saunders uses a relatively uncommon storytelling technique. Like what I mentioned before, it's a frequently changing narration where the speakers are frequently alternating, and it's kind of similar to a choral narration but also kind of similar to like how a play is structured in terms of lines. And this is all interspersed with documentary text. So, what did you think about this? Did this work for the book?
I found it confusing at first. Once I got used to it, I'll say I enjoyed it more, but I don't know if I ever fully loved it. There are moments in the book where I think it's very comical, and those were incidentally some of my favorite moments. But it it was a struggle for me at times.
I think the big question here is why. Like, why did he do it? And and there are a couple of whys here. Like, why did he intersperse historical text? And I believe at times the text is fictionalized. So it's not always historical text, but it always shows up like historical text. Or it always is portrayed or displayed as historical text. So that's the first why. And the second why is why have this kind of narration where you have speakers take turns? For me, the historical text aspect of it is interesting because it calls to mind for me this tension between recorded history and oral history. So, especially when it comes to slavery, I think that's a very important aspect of history and in how we view the stories of that time. So that's why I think he does it. I think that's one justification for doing it. Besides the effect, I think there is kind of like an idea behind that part of structuring the novel.
I think it also contributes to this feeling of I don't know how to put this weight, I guess, this kind of collective weight that is on Abraham Lincoln's shoulders at all times. It's especially present in a couple moments in the book, but throughout the book, we have all of these, myriad voices, and some of them are either benevolent or passive, but there are people that are not on, let's say, history's side as well. And it kind of creates that full picture of America at that time, I guess.
Let me ask a perhaps very basic question. There are a lot of characters who speak in this novel. Does it feel like there are more characters because it uses this format than it would otherwise? Because my sense is it does feel like there are even more characters because of this.
I will point you to the audiobook version of this that has 166 speakers, 166 different voice actors. So, yes, it does feel like there are quite a few.
Right, but does it feel like that because of the narration? Does the narration being divided into all of these different bits of speech enhance that? On a simple level, you do have people's names being called more frequently than you would in other types of narratives, because other narratives, they would just use more pronouns. He said, she said, they said. Here, because the names are always repeated, it's like he's constantly reminding you these are different people.
I will say there are a lot of characters who you do not need to remember, and it is usually clear when that is the case. There are a lot of people who are voicing an opinion, but I don't know if I would call them full characters. They're just background noise. So, in that way, I don't think it makes it feel like there are 166 individual characters that really flesh out the work. There are only, maybe a dozen that really matter, and even out of those, maybe half of those are central.
So, yeah, you're talking about the effect of this form of narration. I think one thing that's interesting is what this narration kind of mirrors is this ability or occurrence in the novel where multiple spirits can kind of meld and merge, and they share a consciousness and share memories. And this way of structuring the form is kind of the same thing, because when you have this monologue that's divided into three speakers taking turns, it's kind of like they are sharing this stream of consciousness and delivering the story. So, in that way, there's this kind of parallel that's going on that I think is interesting. I don't think it's especially deep, but I think it is interesting.
Do you think that it works with the themes of the novel? This is something that kind of bothers me a lot, is that when you look at the form of the novel, it's this very kind of postmodern metafictional thing. But when you look at the themes of the novel, I would say it's not about that at all. It's a very tender human thing. It's not trying to be some sort of wordplay gimmick sort of thing. It's much more about human life. So, does the form and the theme pull against each other in some way?
It doesn't for me, because I don't think that one precludes the other. I think that this is actually one of the things that Saunders and also Vonnegut, who Saunders is often compared to, they both do quite well, because Vonnegut also would play with narration and play with form, but less drastically. But he, would jump forward and back in time. He would have interlacing narrations and play around with like how time works. But Vonnegut, at his core, is a very humanistic writer. He writes about the kind of tragedy of human life. So, the tragic comic nature of human life, I guess, because it's both. So, in that way, I would say that no, because there are other writers who do this, and I don't think one cancels out the other or anything. It's not like there's an ideal form for writing a certain kind of story that deals with humanity. I think you could have an experimental form in this way that can also deal with real human emotions.
I wouldn't say that it doesn't work. I think it does work, but I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, why does it work? Because on the surface of it, at least, it seems like it shouldn't, right? It seems like you have this form that's odd and it takes you out of the story. But then the success of the novel, for me, it depends on forming some sort of empathy, some sort of character identification. So it's like you have this thing that shouldn't work. It seems like these two things are opposed, and yet somehow it does work.
I think he accomplishes it through very careful juxtaposition. And a lot of times, for example, when the speakers switch, actually, there's really not much rhyme or reason for them to switch. So even though it kind of takes you out of the text because they are switching, it doesn't take you out of the story because they're telling the same story. They just continue where the other person left off. What I'm talking about is actually the use of historical text. The historical text, I think, often juxtaposes the feelings that perhaps the public might feel at that moment about President Lincoln compared to his personal tragedy. And because of that juxtaposition, it gives you kind of like a distanced view of a man struggling and suffering. And that heightens his suffering because, for example, there's a section where people criticize him for throwing the party when his son is sick. And you read that and you contrast that with the very real hurt that he's going through after his son has died. And you know that those people who are criticizing him, they don't know the full story. They're just viewing it from afar. And it makes you think about, well, what is the whole story? And you think about how the spirits are able to like inhabit his body, and that's a very visceral kind of experience. It's a very visceral experience where it's as close as you can get to a person, right? You're literally inhabiting their consciousness. And so he's kind of playing with this distance where on the ideal level, you have people looking at it from afar and feeling up close and really inhabiting consciousness. But at the same time, he plays with your emotions because you want to say, well, all these historical records are false. Like, he is not this uncaring person who's throwing a party while his son is sick. Um, so I think he's able to get away with that aspect of it through clever juxtaposition. And I think the actual switching narratives, the actual narrators switching back and forth, it really doesn't have much of an effect because, like we talked about before, they're not really switching perspectives. They're telling the same story. They're just taking turns in terms of who's speaking, but the perspective is the same.